Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lee Pucker. I'm the CEO of the Wireless Innovation Forum, and I'd like to welcome you to our 23rd webinar in the WinForums webinar series. Today's webinar is on CBRS Public Key Infrastructure and Certificate Authorities, All You Need to Know, and it's presented by Ronald Ih of Kyrio. So before we start, a couple of administrative notes. First, I've already gotten questions in the questions box about whether the slides will be available. Yes, the slides will be available on the wirelessinnovationforum.org/webinar site, as well as the recorded webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel, and I've got the link here. If anybody needs that information, just email me or Stephanie, and one of us will be able to get you that information. My email address is here, and Stephanie is stephanie.hamill@wirelessinnovation.org if you need her information as well. A little bit about the interface. Everybody, I'm assuming, has joined the audio already, either using mic and speakers or telephone. You're going to be muted throughout. However, if you have questions that you want to ask, please type your questions into the question window and the questions, and then I will prompt the speaker that there's a question, and we'll go through them. For this talk, you can ask your questions as we go along, and we'll get to them as appropriate. Some of them may be pushed to the end of the talk, and we'll handle most of the questions there, but if there are questions that come out throughout, just feel free to ask. And with that as an introduction, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Ronald Ih. Ron represents Kyrio Security Solutions. Kyrio is one of the three certificate authorities that the Wireless Innovation Forum has authorized for work in the CBRS band. And so he's going to be presenting Kyrio's perspective on how the certificate authorities will be working for CBRS. So Ron, with that, I will turn it over to you.
All right, Lee, thank you very much for the intro. And I'll go and share my screen. Give me a second here. All right, let's see. Is everybody able to see that? Oops. Sorry, I guess the date was not updated, but yeah, just a brief intro. My name is Ronald Ih. I'm Director of Business Development with Kyrio Security Solutions. We provide architecture, consulting, guidance, as well as governance and management of public key infrastructure. We've been doing managing the public key infrastructure for the cable industry for the last almost 20 years or so, and we are very happy to be part of the CBRS ecosystem. Brief overview of what some of the topics we're going to be covering here in this webinar. First of all, why use PKI? Why use public key infrastructure? What is involved with PKI? How do we get started? And there's a timeline for production and getting support from the certificate authorities that are supporting all the efforts and security behind the CBRS wireless ecosystem. So first thing, this may be a little bit elementary for people that are more familiar with networking and security, but I just don't want to make any assumptions anywhere to understand what it is that we're talking about. A lot of the times there's a lot of terms that get thrown around. Everybody wants to talk about security. We need security. Well, what exactly does that mean? The first thing that tends to come to mind for a lot of people when you talk about security is encryption. And it's important to understand that in security, just like any other technical field, there are particular things that perform very specific tasks. The purpose of encryption is to prevent eavesdropping. So if you want to send data from one place to another and you don't want these unauthorized entities on the side to be able to eavesdrop on the data, then you use encryption. So encryption prevents eavesdropping or unauthorized access to data while it is in transit. Now, the problem with encryption by itself is that it does not identify or verify whom it is you are talking to. So this is really what we're talking about with public key infrastructure, is the concept of authentication or identity. What you want to be able to do is not only provide encryption, but also provide authentication. So it's not that one is more important or better than the other. You do need both. But what we're talking about with public key infrastructure is the ability to authenticate and, in other words, verify the identity of someone who is requesting a connection to you. So with the concept of identity in mind, how do you give a device an identity? Going back days of the the old internet and everything, authentication was done by the I guess everybody has their opinion on the username and password. It's not great, but it still exists because it works okay if done properly for a human being. Ideally, it is information that is unique to that individual person. Nobody else should know it, and that is a means of authentication. So that's how you can authenticate that someone who is logging in actually is who they say they are, by providing special information. Now, the problem comes here in autonomous devices, like things like CBRS, IoT, is that now there's no longer a person behind this device. The device logs in by itself. The device attaches to the network and starts sending data by itself. How do you do that? In theory, I guess you could use a username and password, assuming that, okay, yeah, you do it properly, but now then it's also not just an issue of security itself, but it's also an issue of scale, because now you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of devices out there that need to log in and act autonomously. So how do you give an identity to a whole network ecosystem of autonomous devices? So there are a couple ways to do it. One way to do it is known as symmetric key. The concept and the setup is quite simple. Each device has a unique key. When it logs in, it uses that key. And it's relatively quick and easy to set up. The problem with symmetric key is the issue of scale. The more devices you have, the more keys you have. So if you have 200 million devices or whatever it is, then you have 200 million keys. So it obviously can be done. The mobile industry does this right now, but I mean, they are actually looking at ways to, perhaps potentially replace the symmetric key because of this scalability and key management issue. So this comes to asymmetric cryptography, or better known as public key infrastructure and digital certificates. So the way digital certificates work is that each device is issued a certificate. The certificates are unique, but because of the way PKI is architected, you do not need a whole bunch of keys to actually authenticate a very large number of devices. So you can authenticate and verify literally millions of devices with a very small set of keys. So this makes it, excuse me, highly scalable. And each certificate is still unique. So they have uniquely identifiable attributes to them, so you can tell one device from the other, even though they may be the same device coming out of the same factory. Because there's cryptography behind it, it's difficult to spoof. A lot of times people say, well, why can't you just use a MAC address or a device ID? It's just kind of like a name, right? If someone asks you, okay, who are you? I'm Joe Smith. How do you know? Right? You don't if you just use a MAC address or some kind of an ID number, because there's no way to verify it. So with a digital certificate, there is cryptography behind it, so that when somebody issues or provides their digital certificate, if they are not the rightful owner, then basically the math doesn't work. And so that makes it much more difficult to spoof. I won't say it's impossible, but even if that does happen, there are ways to deal with it. And that's basically through revocation and other policy mechanisms that you can use. So this is why PKI has started to get a lot of attention in IoT and device ecosystems, is because of its scalability and its ability to help with the governance and management of ecosystems. So now, with a digital certificate, how does this work as a tamper-resistant identity? Because an identity really is no good if, like, for example, driver's license or something, you can just run it off a copy machine and you can't tell the difference. So this is how you establish a verifiable identity. The easiest way to look at a digital certificate is to think of it as a passport, because they have a number of very similar properties. It's just that one is physical and one is virtual. So passports and digital certificates have the same property in that they are issued by a controlled authority. You can't just get one from anywhere. You can't go to Joe Schmo's copy shop down the street and get a passport. You have to get it from the U.S. State Department. Similarly, a digital certificate comes from an approved authority who acts on behalf of the ecosystem. So the certificate authority does not act on its own. There is a certificate policy and a set of, essentially specifications and procedures that it must follow, and it acts on behalf of the ecosystem, in this case, CBRS. In addition, for a credential, you need to be able to prove that it is real. So in the case of a passport, you have holograms and other physical security that the security agent can look at and see that, yes, it is a real passport. Similarly, there's a digital signature on a certificate which proves that the certificate was issued by an authorized source. Now, just because it's real doesn't mean it's yours, right? So the passport has another feature on it, which is the picture. So it's very possible for someone to steal a passport. It is a real passport. It's just not theirs. So the picture proves that the credential or the passport is actually owned or rightfully owned by the person presenting it. So similarly, there's a private key associated with every digital certificate that never gets exposed, it never gets sent, but it is used in the mathematical cryptographic processes of the handshake to prove that when a device presents its certificate, it is actually the rightful owner of the certificate. So to have a good verifiable identity, you need to have a controlled source. It needs to be real and be proven to be issued from a valid source. And you need to prove that it actually belongs to the bearer of that credential. So with that in mind, this gets used in CBRS and a number of other ecosystems for TLS or various other connection schemes to perform mutual authentication. So whenever a device wants to connect, not only does the device provide its certificate, the server also provides its certificate, because this is to make sure every device knows and can verify with whom it is talking. So again, like I said, there's nothing wrong with encryption. Encryption is necessary but not sufficient. So what we do is combine the authentication with the encryption to provide a much higher level of security. So not only can people not eavesdrop on the transmissions, you also can verify whom you're talking to and that they should actually be someone you are should be communicating with. And so getting into just a little bit of the structure of public key infrastructure, now that we've established that public key infrastructure is a highly scalable and secure way to do authentication. It's a hierarchical type of structure where you have a root which is typically stored offline. So this is basically, you can think of it as the keys to the kingdom, because this is what authorizes everything below it. So typically below the root, you will have a sub-CA, which can be online, and that's what issues the end entity certificates or the device certificates. They typically go into some sort of a chip. It can be stored in the secure memory of a microcontroller or SoC, or a secure element, or however. But the idea there is the device certificate needs to be stored fairly securely, or its private key does, to make sure that the identity of the device cannot be stolen. So what does a typical PKI architecture look like? Like I said, it's a hierarchy. You can have CAs beneath it and sub-CAs. You typically don't want to go too deep in the hierarchy. You can go very wide if you need to. So you could have a lot of sub-CAs. You don't want to go too deep, though. You don't want to go typically much more than, say, like here we have a 4-level. We have the root all the way down to the end certificates. You don't typically want to go more than 4, maybe 5 at the most. And so, as we mentioned before, with revocation, what this allows you to do in this hierarchical setup, and what allows the management of PKI to be quite scalable, is you can selectively disallow certificates. So even if the math and everything works, if the certificate and private key are stolen, you can disallow that certificate. So it can be on the device level, it can be on, say, a sub-CA level, or a higher level CA level. And it's just important to note that if you revoke a CA, you revoke basically or disallow everything that is below it from that point on. So looking at the CBRS PKI hierarchy, you can see that it looks somewhat similar. So there's a number of different CAs there that are for different aspects of the ecosystem. So we have SaaS, domain proxies, professional installers, etc. So each one of these sub-CAs is used to issue certificates of that particular type. They have their particular validity and lifetime. So this is how the CBRS hierarchy is established right now, and we'll see. It probably will evolve over time as new needs and new requirements come along. So here's one thing that's not directly addressed by by CBRS right now. It's just something I'm just going to make a quick note of. Is one of the things you could do is, in addition to just authenticating the device identities, you can also authenticate the code itself. So a lot of times with PKIs, you can add what's called a CVC sub-CA, that stands for Code Verification Certificate. And what you do with that is that if you're a manufacturer and you have authorized access to the PKI, you can have your authorized developers submit code to the system. The CVC sub-CA will sign the code and give you a code certificate. So this allows for devices in the field to not only authenticate their identities, but if there's a software update or something, you can actually validate that the code is safe and came from an authorized source. It's very common in a lot of applications because you never know. You can receive a software package from someone, from somewhere, and you want to be able to verify that you should actually install and execute this code. So this is commonly used in a number of different industries. So for the certificate authorities, we perform a specific function. We help define the ecosystem certificate policy. So the certificate policy, you'll hear this a lot in the working groups and everything, and it's important to note that we are bound by contract to adhere to the certificate policy. We cannot deviate from that. That's what our web trust certification and everything requires us to follow, and it requires us to follow the certificate policy to the letter. So we do apologize in advance if sometimes on the security side we seem a little bit inflexible, but this is why, is because we are required to behave in that fashion. So it's a little bit strict, but there are some good reasons for it. So now what we also do is we help to architect, construct, deploy, and operate the PKI according to the CP and specifications of the ecosystem. We also enforce the procedural and physical security requirements. So just because the PKI is up doesn't mean anybody can come in and request and get certificates willy-nilly. I'll get into that a little bit later. But basically, there are requirements for you to be eligible to receive certificates. And we are sort of the gateway that makes sure that only people that are eligible to receive certificates actually get them. We act on behalf of the owners of the PKI and the ecosystem, like the board of directors. So a CA, maybe there's some concern sometimes about revocation or other things. We cannot arbitrarily revoke or do something. We can only act at the behest of the board of directors or the owners of the PKI. And as I mentioned before, there are some inflexibilities built into this. Is that we must comply with the with the specifications and certificate policy that are fully approved. So if something's not fully approved, we cannot implement it. So using certificates to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem, that's really the baseline or the underlying purpose of this whole PKI and the digital certificates. So to start out with CBRS, the core of the whole thing is the spectrum allocation server. So that basically determines what is available and who gets to use what at what time. Of course, there's a whole network of CBSDs that are out there, and you'll see that all of these, whether it's a domain proxy or a CBSD, anything that talks directly to a SAS must have its certificate. And basically that's so the SAS can authenticate and know that something that wants to talk to it actually is approved to be on the network. In addition, you have the certified professional installers who will be entering data into the SAS by various means, but here for simplification, they are logging directly into the SAS itself. So in order to get access to the SAS, again, you need to have a digital certificate. So the CPI can prove that they are authorized to have access to the system. All of these different digital certificates are issued by the CBRS PKI operated by Kyrio and the other CAs of CBRS. So this basically forms part of a pipeline that controls access and allows CBRS to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem by controlling who can participate. So you have devices and systems and these things that want to participate in the CBRS ecosystem. So they must go through various testing and certification procedures to prove that they comply with specifications, they meet all the requirements, etc. And so those go through the authorized test labs. CPIs, for example, must go through an approved training program administrator to prove that they are competent enough to enter the data correctly. And then, of course, there's the FCC that's involved to make sure that everybody is, within proper limits of transmission power and all their other requirements. So when someone or something, a product, has gone and passed certification, that information gets passed on to the certificate authority like Kyrio, and we can say, okay, yes, we verify that this device is eligible and this company and device is eligible to receive certificates. Yes, we will provide you with the certificates that you can then put into the product. And all of this is to make sure that everything that has their certificate or their passport to the CBRS ecosystem is authorized to be there. And this is to maintain not just security, but make sure it all interoperates and every device performs as it's expected to perform as part of the overall ecosystem. So how do we get started with CBRS certificates? As I mentioned before, there's different elements of the CBRS ecosystem, and each requires a different certificate. So first, you must know which type of certificate it is you need to request. So obviously, if you're making a domain proxy or CBSD, you need to request the appropriate certificate. In addition to the SAS. Now, the CPIs are a little bit different because they are not devices per se. The CPI is an individual person, and that's important to note. The CPI, that person, individual, receives a certificate when they complete the training program for the whichever SASs they are working with, and also that digital certificate is tied to the person, not to whatever company they happen to be working for. So if they are working with company A, while they get certified and get their CPI certificate, and then they change jobs and go to company B, the CPI certificate goes with them. So it's basically, you can think of it as a personal identity. It's sort of like being a notary public, right? So they get their certificate, and it goes with them wherever they go. So who needs certificates? Essentially, all entities that will be connecting to a SAS must have a digital certificate to access the system and the network. So this would be CBSDs, maybe high-power CPEs, domain proxy servers, SAS, and CPIs. Devices behind a DP that will never directly connect to a SAS You might not need a certificate. It depends on how you're going to do your SKU management, really. But they do require a means of authentication between the CBSD and the domain proxy. So if the company or the manufacturer has their own means of doing it, that is fine. But there needs to be some security behind that to make sure that when the CBSD connects to the domain proxy, that it's not just anybody that can do it. So it's, if you like, you can still put the certificate into the CBSD. It's up to that manufacturer. But anything that connects directly to the SaaS must have a certificate. Actually, some of these numbers have changed. I think they will be changed as of the current certificate policy. The length of validity for the SaaS and domain proxy is 15 months. I believe it will be changing in the next month or so to 60 months. CPI is 5 years, CBSD is 10 years, and then there's still, we're working on the PAL certificates right now in a task group. For the CBSDs, if you have a OEM sub-CA, a sub-CA certificate life is 30 years. So right now, basically the latest CP was approved on the 29th of January. So as we said before, the CAs must comply to the current approved certificate policy as written exactly. So we expect for us to be able to start issuing certificates in mid to late February, assuming everything goes smoothly with the deployment of the sub-CAs. So corporate managed CRA, the CRA stands for Certificate Requesting Accounts, require 2 to 3 days for verification and authentication. And CPI accounts, the way that we currently see this working is that they will be an authorized user under the TPA corporate account. And this takes typically about 48 hours to process. These processing times are approximate. Typically, we could do it in less time. It just depends on the current load and situation at the time. So the way that this works is that the SaaS CBSD, basically hardware manufacturers can contact Kyrio to sign a DCSA. This stands for a Digital Certificate Subscriber Agreement. So we will validate the company and key contact info for each corporate account. So this also applies to the TPAs. And so what will happen is that they will create a corporate account with Kyrio. They can do bulk purchases of certificates and whatnot to include with their with the certification program pricing that they give to CPIs, or they can have the CPIs purchase these certificates on their own separately. It is up to the TPA how they want to do that. So for SaaS, or basically hardware vendors, TPAs, they will be setting up their corporate CRA accounts. For the CPIs, the current process involves the TPA validating their personal identity. So this means them providing their driver's license or passport and other identity to verify their personal identification. And then once passing the course, they will become an authorized user under the TPA main account. So it's important to know the timeline for companies wanting to set up an account with Kyrio. There is typically 2, maybe 3 days, depending on if there's a lot of people coming in at the same time, to set up the CRA account. And it's important to factor in that, okay, there is this processing time. Setting up a CRA is not like setting up your Facebook account where you provide your email address, password, and you're off and going. We verify the company, so you provide company information. We verify that the company actually is who they say they are, that they're listed. We verify authorized user identities. We do a fair amount of authentication behind it to make sure that the company is actually who they say they are, and that we should actually grant them access to the system. When you are submitting information, or wanting to get a CRA, make sure that you have some of this information ahead of time already prepared. It will make the processing a little bit faster. Basically, you need to have thought ahead of time of who do you want to be your designated account administrators. These are people within your company that are going to be the admins for your corporate account. Authorized users, legal technical contacts, and these kind of information. So there's some people within your company that need need to have special roles because they will be the authorized users to have access to the CRAs for your company. So certificate purchasing. You can think of certificates, they're almost like virtual components, right? So each is unique because we have to generate them, serialize them, sign them, and everything. So each certificate is unique, individually generated and signed within the PKI trust structure. Certificates are inventoried like physical goods, but they're not taxed as such. So you purchase blocks of certificates, 100, 500, 1,000, or whatever, and we generate them and they sit in your inventory. So as you download them and install them in your products, that inventory gets decremented. So you can think of it as a virtual component that goes into your product. So just like a lot of hardware, there is a volume purchasing component to it because it's more economical per unit on a per unit basis to do larger batches of certificates than one or two at a time. And as I mentioned before, as you use them up, they come out of your inventory just like physical goods. So going through a typical process flow for a when you're setting up a CRA as a manufacturer. So first you will contact us. You can apply for a CRA and the types of certificates you anticipate needing to purchase. So we will send the appropriate subscriber agreements back to the company, to you, and you complete the agreement, which includes all the company information as well as legal, corporate contacts, and administrative users for your account. Then we start the authentication process, like I said, typically 2 days, maybe up to 3, to authenticate all the information, verify eligibility, and then we can create the certificate requesting account for the company. We notify you when the account is ready, and then you can access the portal. You can order your certificate batches, and then you're pretty much off and running after that. And then you can download the certificates in various ways. You can download them securely through the portal and then install them yourself. We do have some options to actually have an API, a secure API. So like on your factory floor, we can work out, we can talk to you about how to implement a secure authentication system for, say, like a production tester to access the system and directly download certificates to be put into the manufacturing line. For CPIs, it's a little more complicated, just because the CPI is sort of like a third party outside of that. So the TPA will create their CRA as similar to the earlier process. So the CPI will register for the course. The TPA will verify their personal identity, and then the CPI will take the training course. Once the CPA completes it, the TPA will compile a data file of all the CPIs in the current class or however they want to organize it and send it over to us as the certificate authority. We will log all the information for the CPIs, and then we will make all of the new CPIs authorized users under the TPA's corporate account, CRA account, so that then the CPI can log into the portal. They will have their limited access and then be able to download their certificate. And once they download the certificate and the private key, they can install that into whichever device they're going to use to access the SAS system and to begin entering data from CBSDs into the SAS. So to work with one of the CAs, of course, as myself, you can contact me directly, r.ih@kyrio.com. For operational issues and everything, questions, we have pkiops@kyrio.com, and we have our website, kyrio.com security services. And of course, we have the other two CAs as well. We have Insta and Digicert, and you can contact them on their respective websites. So I think that pretty much covers it, and happy to take any questions that have come over the chat line.
Thanks, Ron. So some of these, the first question, Sorry, somebody just entered a really large question and it pulled my entire screen to pop up. Okay, the first question is, what's the process to renew a certificate?
The way this works is that when it gets close to expiration, we will contact customers and send them a notification, say, hey, these certificates are going to be expiring soon. And we can help you with the purchase of a new batch of certificates to install them in the devices. Now, the actual installation of the certificates into the devices is up to the manufacturer, if they have a system to be able to do that. Most of the hardware certificates are fairly long-lived. Like, for example, CBSDs, they have a 10-year life. I'm not sure what the typical expected hardware life is for one of those devices, but yeah, they last a pretty long time. So domain proxies and Sasas are servers that are generally network accessible. So you should be able to purchase new certificates and install them when needed. Those are every 5 years or so.
Thanks, Ron. We've gotten quite a few questions about how much things cost, and I would suggest that maybe those are questions that people should follow up with you directly offline. Maybe if you can back up a slide and put your contact information back up there, then people can follow up with you offline on things like cost.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Cost and everything, they are specific to each CA. Please feel free to reach out to me. You can, reach out to us You can reach out to me directly on my email address or through our website and contact form, and we'd be happy to talk to you, provide you with a price list. If you have particular volume requirements and everything, we're happy to discuss that with you.
Okay. Next question. If a training program administrator is using one of the 3 WinForm approved vendors for their CPI certificates, and the company where the trained technician is working is using a different CA vendor, will there be a conflict?
No, that should not really matter, because all Sasas and systems within the CBRS ecosystem are required to support all 3 CAs. So regardless of which one you use, they should all authenticate properly.
Okay. I think this ties into what you just said. Do all Sasas get the certifications for every certified technician? If so, how does this process occur?
Okay, so my understanding is that what we will do is that we will register the public key or maybe the certificate for each CPI, so they can the SAS can do a lookup to make sure that, okay, yeah, I know that actual certificate, and then the cryptography will also prove that person using it or providing the certificate is actually that person. So yes, there will be the Sasas will have a log or database of all the CPI certificates and public keys.
Okay. Are there WinForm guidelines or requirements on how digital certificates are to be provided to the newly certified technician?
So the CPI process is still a little bit of a work in progress, and we're working that out. But basically, right now, once they complete the program, the CPI will download their certificate and its private key to their device. That, at least at this point, is assumed it will be installed either into a browser or some sort of an app that the CPI will use when connecting with the SAS. And so let's just say it's in an app or something and it connects to one of the Sasas, during the process of the handshake and connection with the SAS, it will take the digital certificate and use that for authentication. There may have to be a slight process when the CPI first installs their app to say, okay, install your certificate as well, and that will be part of the setup process for the CPI's device.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Next question. If you buy a block of certs and they are in storage, how quickly can they be accessed?
Typically, it takes about 24 hours, usually less. to actually have the certificates be generated and accessible. So, I mean, like I said, to be conservative, I would say 24 hours. It's typically much less than that.
Okay. Can you explain a little more about how the private key is used in the validation process? If it's never exposed outside of its owner, how is it used in conjunction with the public key to identify a user or device?
Okay, well, we've got to get into a little bit of the sausage making of cryptography here. Essentially, what happens is that in the exchange, let's just say it's the CPI, right? So it gives the certificate, and the certificate contains a bunch of data as well as a public key. So what happens is that first the SAS will verify the certificate, by using its various public keys and the root certificate that it has to prove first, as we saw earlier in one of the other slides, to prove the authenticity of the CPI certificate. So it proves that it came from one of the authorized CAs, that it's valid, that all the math works. And then what happens is that they call it a challenge. A lot of times it's a random number challenge or something where now, okay, I have your public key. I'm going to give you a random number. You've got to hash it. You've got to sign it with your private key and send that back to me. So that's sort of the challenge response. So when the response comes back, since I have the public key, I'm going to check it out and make sure that the numbers match. And so in this way, I can verify if you have the associated private key, which goes with the public key that you sent me, without ever having seen or sending the private key. So it's basically done mathematically through a random number challenge and response.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Next question. What are the security requirements for how certificates are stored on end entities?
That's a little trickier one because this comes down to the manufacturer. The certificate policy states that they should be stored. I don't know the exact wording, but I mean in a reasonably secure manner. The most important aspect of it is the private key. The certificate and the public key, obviously, I mean they're sent over the air. They're meant to be public. That's not really that important. It's the private key that is important. Ideally, the private key is stored in some kind of hardened memory or inaccessible. In a previous life, I sold actually secure element products, so they're sort of like TPMs or these kind of things where private keys were stored in inaccessible memory slots. You cannot, address them. You cannot even physically access them. Even if you decap the chips and try to probe the memory, you basically cannot get to the private keys. Now, we're not requiring that level of security, but the manufacturers or anybody having a certificate should take reasonable precautions to make sure that the private key is not easily accessible, especially like over the network or in any sort of remote scalable fashion.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Next question. For domain proxy certification, is there an option of wildcard cert available?
A wildcard cert. I guess I'm not quite sure what that means. Is that something that where is it possible to get a clarification on that question?
Yeah, so if the person who submitted the question can maybe submit a clarification, then I'll follow up then.
Okay.
Some more questions on money, which I know you can't answer. We've actually gotten quite a few questions on how to become a CPI and training program administrators. Richard, are you still online?
I am. I'm happy to answer that.
So everyone, this is Richard.
Hello, everybody.
This is Richard Bernhardt, who is from WISPA, and he chairs the group that's evaluating the CPI training program administrators. We've gotten multiple different questions on that, so maybe you can give an overview of the program, Richard?
Sure. So a number of you have asked questions about whether or not you can seek out a TPA or a training program administrator to have your CPIs trained. The answer is shortly. We are in the process of doing an accreditation of about 7 different programs. There are a few more that may be added to that. All of those programs are at various stages of their accreditation, which allows them to train CPIs and ultimately certify CPIs. They will be in all different formats. Some of them will be online, some of them will be in person, some of them will do live over the internet, and others will do typical classroom type of presentations on the road. They will cover all of the material that is necessary for the material that Ron described today, probably not in as much detail as what Ron described today, because they need to show the CPI how to connect with the CA, how to use a certificate when it's doing its role in the field, and generally how to register CBSDs using that identification. Expect that within the next month or so there will be, just as there are now on your screen, 3 certified or 3 approved CBRS CAs. There will be a grouping of approved or an accredited training program administrators, and those approved training program administrators will be able to train CPIs. They'll be all across the country in all different areas, and they should be available shortly after they're accredited. Some of them will still be working on their training program and examination and so forth, so we'll let you know. All of the information on the CAs and all of the information on the CPIs can be found on the WinForum website. If you go there, just tap on the CBRS R standards, and if you look up at the top of the website, there's some drop downs, and you can find both the CPI and the CA information there. You can also see the standards for both, and all of the CBRS standards from WinForum, in fact. So I hope that answers your question. The program should be available before ICD. That's what we're shooting for. And then, of course, into commercialization as we go forward for both the CAs. The CA guys are already ready as soon as they can move forward. And the CPIs, training organizations, should be ready shortly thereafter. Are there any further questions on CPI? Lee, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I'm just looking to see if there are more questions in here related to CPI that I want to pass on to you, but I don't see any.
Okay.
So why don't we pop back to Ron? Next question on what you presented today is, are CRLs shared between all 3 root CAs?
I'm going to have to probably get back to you on that. My understanding is that the CRLs basically get published to OCSP servers, so they should be, but I have to, I guess, probably talk to some of the other network architects and just make sure that that is actually a correct statement. Logically, yes, they should be, because any device needs to be able to go out and check for the revocation status of any certificate. So the SAS has to be able to go out, look up a master list somewhere, and make sure that it has the most updated information on revocation status of all the devices. But yes, we'll have to. I have to confirm. I have to confirm with that.
Okay. Next question. How is the private key obtained for domain proxy? Is there a secure connection to download the certificate?
Yes. So the portals that we work with, I mean, I can't speak for the other CAs, but I'm assuming that they have a similar system, is that there is a secure portal that is accessible for authorized users to download certificates and private keys that are generated from our PKI. As I mentioned before, there's also APIs that are available. I have to see what the process is to actually do that, but I mean, in a more automated fashion, it is possible to use a secure API to also download certificates from a company's CRA, certificate requesting account.
Okay. Next question is, once device certification gets done, does the certification lab provide an update automatically to the CAs?
Actually, probably Lee, I'm going to have to ask you and Richard about how that process works. I think they provide it to WinForum, and then we check with you. Is that right?
Yeah, that's effectively it. I mean, so for a CBSD, for example, once the FCC has certified the CBSD and issued the FCC ID, the FCC will post that in a public database. And then if a CBSD manufacturer needs to contact their certificate authority to get a certificate issued for that CBSD, the CA can basically just look in the FCC database and see if that's a valid FCC ID. We send to the CAs the links that they need to use for validation of those. So, for example, we've already sent a link to the equipment authorization database for the CBSDs. Once the Sasas get certified, we will send, and that'll happen through a public notice. Then we'll send a copy of that public notice to the CAs and say, based on these public notice, the SAS administrators listed here are now eligible to receive their production certs. So that's kind of the process that we follow. It's a bit more manual, but it happens fairly quickly. Richard, did you want to expand on that any?
No, I think that's a good explanation. The FCC ID being generated is basically showing that the lab has completed their testing and issued the FCC ID, and then we follow the process you just mentioned so that the CA has availability to see that CBSD or that type of CBSD is available and what its FCC ID is from there. So I agree with what you said.
Okay. Next question, does the SAS have to use the same root CAs as the domain proxy?
No, they do not. I think it's kind of similar to the other one, is that the way that everything is set up, each one of the CAs publishes their root certificate, and so that allows you to authenticate or do a chain validation of any certificate, regardless of if it came from one or the other of the CAs. So all of the elements of the CBRS ecosystem are required to be able to authenticate and chain validate a certificate from any of the CA providers.
Okay. Next question. Are production certificates required for ICD? So ICD, for those of you who don't know, is initial commercial development or initial commercial deployment.
So my understanding is yes, because I think ICD, I mean, it's initial, but it's still a commercial deployment. So I think the one thing that we have to, I think Lee and Richard, we talked about this at the face-to-face, was that I guess the Sasas may have provisional approval. But basically, yeah, in order to, for ICD, you need to have a production certificate.
Yeah, I think I can shed a little bit more light on that. The ICD, or the initial commercial deployment, is a field test of the SAS in real circumstances. So it's by public notice from the FCC, and the Sasas have submitted plans based upon how they want to deploy real clients into the field. And so for all intents and purposes, it is a full commercial regular deployment, and CPIs will be required, certified equipment will be required, Sasas will be provisional in that, only that they're don't have their final certification. That pends the end of their ICD period, but they will be operating as a SAS, so the certifications are full for those things.
Okay. Next question. We've got time, I think, for a couple of more. Slides have highlighted the domain proxy manufacturer applying for a domain proxy certificate. Can the operator apply for domain proxy certificates?
The network operator?
It just says operator.
I believe so. Yeah, so Yeah, I guess it just kind of depends on what their purchase process is. So, for example, like if they have a vendor who makes the domain proxies, the vendor could bundle in the domain proxy certificate in with the system price, or they just give them the box, and then it's the operator that has to get their own certificate and put it into the box. It's mostly, I guess, a matter of whatever their preferred manufacturing flow and cost structure is.
Can I insert something here? Because there are so many questions here on the question of how much things cost, whether it be CPI, TPA, CA. The wonder of this ecosystem is that there are a number of commercial providers in each one of these areas, and they all do their own programs. Ron has been being very courteous today in providing on behalf of Kyrio, but there are 3 CAs, and each one of them will do things slightly differently, and will have different offerings. The TPAs, each one of the TPAs are the companies that train the CPIs. They each will have their own offerings, and some of them will have specialized offerings to offer additional information and training that goes even beyond the standard or required CPI training. So the pricing of these things, some will be inclusive of things that you're hearing today, some may be piecemeal. It's up to the commercial interest that's doing this, and it will vary from company to company, and we recommend that you go and reach out to the companies that are offering these services so you can see their pricing. It wouldn't be fair if we gave out prices on a webinar like this with regards to any of this material, but they will be willing to talk to you about those things.
Okay, next question. I think we'll do just a couple of more. I think you answered this already. Would a domain proxy need multiple end entity certificates to talk to multiple Sasas?
No, it should not. It should just have its one domain proxy certificate, and you should be able to talk to all the Sasas, and they will be able to authenticate it as long as the domain proxy certificate is within its validity period.
Okay. Okay, we had the follow-up on the wildcard certificate. They sent a Wikipedia link on what a wildcard certificate is, and basically said it's a certificate that can be shared and used by multiple hosts.
This is for the domain proxy?
Yeah, hold on. I have to go back to the wildcard certificate question.
Yeah, in general, let's see, I'd have to go back to the certificate policy to see if that is permitted or not. I mean, from a security standpoint, in general, it's not good practice because if you have multiple entities using the same certificate, that means you have multiple entities that are sharing the same private key, right? It's kind of like having, well, hey, let's all share the same passport, right? I think from a security standpoint, it's not a good idea. But I'll have to double check into the certificate policy to see if that's permitted. I don't think it is.
Next question. When certificate is renewed for SAS, can we assume that the root CA certificate chain remains the same and no update is required on the domain proxy CBSD side?
Yeah, the root and everything remains the same. You just renew the certificate. The actual PKI or the chain remains the same. The root, I have to look at it. I forgot what the length is. I think it's at least 35 years, maybe up to 50. So the root will be around for a while.
Okay. Next question. Are there plans to support OCSP in addition to CRL? And what's the timeline for this?
I believe OCSP is supported. I remember seeing it in the CP. It's a long document. But to my knowledge, yes, OCSP is supported. That was actually part of the one of the things we had to fix when we went from CP version 1.0 to version 1.2 was that there was an omission in the sub-CA certificates that did not include support for CRL and OCSP. So that has been fixed. For Kyrio, we already support CRL and OCSP, so we can do that already.
Okay. I believe that is all of the questions.
Cool, right on time too.
Yeah, so well done.
Excellent.
Oh yeah, somebody somebody just replied to what you said. Is yes, in release 1 we only support CRL. In release 2, so it looks like OCSP is planned for release 2.
Yep.
So with that, I think we'll close the questions. If I'd like to thank Ron. I'd like to thank you again for doing the presentation and taking time to answer all these questions. We really appreciate it. And thanks as well for your help, Richard.
No problem.
For those who are interested, we are recording this webinar and it'll be posted on our YouTube channel later, so you can go back and refer to it as well. And then we'll be sending out a satisfaction survey to everyone to get your feedback on the webinar so that we can see how we can improve these in the future. With that, I'm going to close the webinar for today. Thanks again for everybody in the audience for your participation, and thanks to all the panelists for all the work you put into pulling this together. It's really appreciated.
Have a great day.
Sure, my pleasure.